Well, good morning, and many of you guys know in a previous job I worked for a particular cell phone provider that I won't name this morning to not implicate the guilty, but I had a job where I did not like it at all. I'm pretty sure you guys can relate. Part of the reason I didn't like it is because I had to sell people a bunch of things that they didn't even need and couldn't afford, and so I'm like, I don't want to do this. And so I didn't like the job at all. The only thing I liked was my coworkers and getting to know them and spend time with them. And so one day this guy comes in, goes to one of our sales reps and says he wants to open a business account for 100 lines and get 100 iPhones. Now, typically, if someone walks in, they had all the business, information to make that possible or to give them credibility. But when someone walks in and says that, typically it's fraud. And so the rep kind of does all this stuff, and the fraud department says, no, you can't do it. However, the rep really want to do it because 100 lines, especially business lines, pays out really well. Now, if it ends up being fraud, you get what's called a chargeback. And so next month, he would start 100 lines in the hole, but the commission he would have made was so large on this particular deal that it would have been worth not getting any commission the next month. So not only was he really bent on making this work, our managers also wanted to make it work because it would reflect well on our store, especially 100 business ads. Like, that's a really big deal. And so they're trying to make this thing go through. Now, this guy, of course, at the end of the day, when it doesn't go through, when it's counted as fraud, this kind of fake business would go away. It could also really hurt his credit score, but 100 iPhones is a lot of money. And so they're trying to push it through, and I'm really upset, and so are some of my other coworkers, because if it goes through, this means next month our quotas would go up. And the store's quotas would go up. Now, the rep doesn't care because he's getting paid regardless, and the managers don't care because 100 lines for the entire store isn't that big of a deal. It only hurts all of us who are not getting paid off of this transaction. So I'm really upset about it, but at the end of the day, there is nothing that I could do. I couldn't stop it, I couldn't end it, but it had negative impacts on me and how much money I was able to make. And I share that story because I think all of us can relate with the question we're looking at this morning. And that's, how should we respond when life is unfair? Right, when things happen in our life, particularly if they negatively impact us, and particularly if there's nothing that we can even do about them, how do we respond in those moments when things are not fair and it is completely out of our control? That's exactly what we're going to be looking at this morning as we continue through the book of Esther. And so if you have a Bible, go ahead and open up to Esther chapter 2. If you don't, there's a black one somewhere around you, and if you do not own a Bible, you can take one of those black ones home. It is our gift to you. Now, we started the book of Esther at the beginning of January. If you haven't been here, I'll try to give you the super cliff note versions in the next 60 seconds. Esther takes place in 480 BC in the Empire of Persia. At this time in human history, it is the most powerful and largest empire that the world has ever seen. You have King Xerxes, or his Hebrew name, as he's predominantly referred to throughout the book of Esther, as Ahasuerus. He's the king of Persia, and he is he's staging this very massive military campaign against Greece. And so the book begins in chapter 1, where he has this 6-month banquet trying to rally the troops in the kingdom together. At the end of this banquet, he calls on his queen Vashti to come and present herself, essentially naked, to those who are attending the party. She says no, and so he disposes of her as queen. Chapter 2 picks up after their failed military conquest against Greece. He's upset. He's kind of licking his wounds, and one of his officials says to him, well, hey, maybe one thing to help you feel better is if you pick a new queen. And so last week we saw the process of what that looked like. It was a very sad and evil process where they would take women across the entire empire, bring them into the kingdom, give them kind of a year of beauty treatments and training, if you will, for their one night for the king, of which they would spend the rest of their lives in the harem, away from their friends and family, although one of them would become queen, and Esther, who this book is named after, is the one who actually becomes queen. And so that's the super cliff note versions, and that's where we pick up the story. Chapter 2, verse 19, soon after Esther has become queen, it says this: When the virgins were gathered a second time, Mordecai was sitting at the king's gate. Esther had not revealed her family background or her ethnicity, as Mordecai had directed. She obeyed Mordecai's orders, as she always had done while he raised her. And so Mordecai was Esther's cousin. Esther was essentially an orphan, and so Mordecai kind of was her legal guardian growing up. And what we see here is that sometime after Esther becomes queen, we're not exactly sure how long this is. This could be about 6 months, maybe up to a year. This might be referring to when the coronation of her becoming queen takes place. We see Mordecai sitting at the king's gate. Now, again, as we saw last week, Mordecai was a Jew, but he was not a very faithful Jew, and he had completely assimilated into Persian culture. And the king's gate is where things of politics and the kingdom were discussed, where Mordecai finds himself. And he had told Esther to hide her Jewish ethnicity, and so she is now queen, but nobody knows that she is a Jew. Verse 21, it says this: "During those days, while Mordecai was sitting at the king's gate, Bigthan and Teresh, two of the king's eunuchs who guarded the entrance, became infuriated and planned to assassinate King Ahasuerus. When Mordecai learned of the plot, he reported it to Queen Esther, and she told the king on Mordecai's behalf." And so Mordecai is there when kind of this plot is unfolded. He hears about it. He tells the queen tells the king about it, and she also gives credit to Mordecai for being the one who finds out that this assassination attempt was going to try to take place. And here's what happens next, 23. "When the report was investigated and verified, both men were hanged on the gallows. This event was recorded in the historical record in the king's presence." Now, this might not seem much to us, but if you were an original reader of this book, this verse would have been a very significant thing for you. The biggest reason, as we are going to find out later, is that this account was recorded, and later on in Esther, the king is going to read about it, and something is going to come about it in the future. But what was tradition, what typically happened when someone like Mordecai found out about an assassination attempt or did anything that ended up being a very good thing for the king, that person was often immediately and publicly rewarded. Why? Because the king would want to reward this type of behavior in the kingdom. The king wants to stay alive, and so people that help that happen typically get lavishly rewarded publicly so that other people could say, I want to do exactly what that person did so that maybe I can get some of those same rewards. But yet what we see is that does not happen. Right? Nothing happens to Mordecai for doing this. And so in this situation, this would have been a very unfair thing for Mordecai. In fact, this might be the first time, if you're an original reader of this text, if you are trying to be a faithful Jew and you're not quite sure how you feel about Mordecai up until this point, you might start to get some sympathy for him because he does do a good thing, but nothing happened, right? This would have been a very unfair thing for him. And like I said, all of us, again, we're looking at this question, what do we do when life's unfair? And what do we do when we feel like we've done the right thing, or maybe we feel like we've been faithful to where God has placed us, and things don't happen the way that we want them to happen? Like my story that I've shared often, I can think of a great example of this. When I was in college, my wife and I, Christina, we got married. We helped this church plant. I was doing my master's. And we were working on all these part-time jobs because we wanted to one day plant a church. And about 2 years after we were into this church plant, I started applying to some other churches, some other a little bit larger and growing churches, because I was like, okay, I see what happens in the beginning. What happens when the church has been around? How do you do systems and structures? And so, again, thought I did the right thing. We didn't get any full-time jobs after we graduated like our friends did. And applying to all these churches, we get nothing. Right, get nothing. Eventually, I landed a job here in Raleigh at that cell phone provider. And part of the reason I didn't like that job was not just because I didn't want to be there, but because it wasn't unfair. I was like, God, I did all the right things. I did what I thought I was supposed to do. I didn't make any money. We had this super shoestring budget, and now I'm here. This is not fair. And so I was frustrated the entire 2 years I was at that job. And I think you and I can relate to that. And here's why it's important for us to understand, or important for us to read this text and see how God impacts when things happen in our life that are not fair. Here's what I want us to know, that our level of trust in God determines our response to unfair treatment. Right? When things happen to us in our lives that maybe we perceive as unfair or very well could be unfair, whether they were self-inflicted or not, our level of trust, do we actually think God is good? Do we actually think he will provide in ways that are best for us, even if we do not like them? Right? That determines our attitude and our response when things aren't going the way we want them to go. Now, what's interesting for Mordecai is that he very well likely was upset about this, but it was actually a very good thing. It was actually God's faithfulness that he is actually not going to be rewarded until later, because he's going to be rewarded later in a way that's a much bigger scale than would have taken place if he was rewarded now. Or I think back to my own story, how I was frustrated that I was in this job that I did not want to be in for 2 years, doing things that I thought were unfair. As I look back on it now, I see God's faithfulness, that I needed to learn things, that I needed to do some things that I could not have learned and done had I not been in that situation, right? Our level of trust in God determines our response to unfair treatment, because when we do not trust him, right, when we don't think that he has our best interests in mind, we do what is referred to as revenge, right? Or vengeance, right? You and I take revenge on people and situations when we think it's up to us in order to make whatever outcome we want to have happen. And so, like, I think of my kids, my son Roman, he's almost 2, and our daughter Finley, who's almost 5. Like, they're awesome, and Roman's awesome, and I love him, but he's a little bit of a bully. right? And so Christine and I are trying to like get that bully out of him before he goes to school. And he's also a toddler, so, they do toddler things. And so there are many times, multiple times, every single day, where he is messing with Finley. And Finley doesn't like it. And so in that moment, when Roman is doing unfair and not very nice things to Finley, she has a choice to make. Do I tell mom and dad, or do I not? Right? Do I actually trust that mom and dad are going to inflict the correct punishment in the situation, or do I not think that? Because if I don't think they're going to do that, then I'm going to take care of this myself. Now, to be fair to Finley, I don't know that she's exactly thinking along those lines, but it's probably somewhat of a motivating factor, right? Does she believe that mom and dad will deal with this, or does she think whatever we decide to do with Roman isn't fair, and so she's going to take care of it herself, right? Our level of trust in God in the same way determines our response to unfair treatment. And what's interesting is that things actually are going to get even more unfair as we pick up the story, chapter 3, verse 1. It says this: After all this took place, King Ahasuerus honored Haman, the son of Hammedatha, the Agagite. He promoted him in rank and gave him a higher position than all the other officials. Now, what's happening here, this is, again, roughly about 5 years, probably, after Esther becomes queen and the assassination attempt fails. We're not told exactly why, but something happened where this guy named Haman becomes promoted to the highest official in the kingdom. Now, you're already like, what did he do to get promoted? Because Mordecai did something cool and he didn't get anything. But if you're an original reader of this text, this would have been a massive red flag for you. Because not only was this guy promoted for no reason, but he was an Agagite. Now, Haman is very similar to the Hebrew word Hamal, which means wrath. So again, if you're an original reader, you're not only like the fact that he's an Agagite, which we're going to talk about in a second, but you're also seeing, okay, that there's something evil about this man. Now, here's why this would have been such a big deal to an original reader. Not only, again, this guy gets promoted for no reason that we know of, at least the story doesn't tell, but he's also an Agagite. And so I want to take about 60 seconds and explain to you, just so we can understand what this would have been like for an original reader, why this would have been such a big deal that an Agagite would get promoted over a Jew. So an Agagite was the same thing as an Amalekite. And the Amalekites were the very first people to attack Israel after they were rescued from the Promised Land. So Israel's out of Egypt. They're on their way to the Promised Land. And for no reason, Israel did not do anything. The Amalekites find out about it, and they go and attack them and try to completely destroy and kill them. This is, if you're somewhat familiar with the story, this is the battle where Moses has to hold the staff over his head as God is kind of intervening on behalf of the Israelites. And so the Israelites do end up kind of surviving, winning the battle, and the Amalekites retreat, and they leave. And after this, God promises Moses that he would completely wipe out the Amalekites off the face of the earth. Now, we're going to talk about this in a few weeks. What do we do in the Old Testament where God seems to command Israel to attack other nations? Like, it doesn't sit right in our souls. And so we're not going to get into that this morning, but I will just say this, that an attack on God's people, who he graciously chose in the Israelites, was actually an attack on the entire human race. Why? Because God is using Israel to be the nation from which the Messiah, the Savior of the world, would come. And so if Israel was wiped out, there would be no hope for anyone. So it is not a good thing to attack the Israelites, especially for no reason. And so he basically says, when the Israelites get to the Promised Land, I want you to attack the Amalekites, and I will be with you, and I want you to destroy them. So they get into the Promised Land. Eventually, Saul becomes king. He's the first king of Israel. God commands them to go and attack the Amalekites, and at this point in time, Agag is the king of the Amalekites. So Saul goes, the Israelite army goes, they attack the Amalekites, but they are not faithful because they win the war, but Saul spares the life of King Agag and some of his best sheep and cattle and resources. So they're not faithful then, and because of that, ever since that time, the Amalekites and or the Agagites have been a constant source of battle, frustration, and pain for the Israelites. And this is yet another reminder that because Israel was not faithful, they're still feeling the effects of it. So there is this massive animosity and hatred between the Jewish people and the Agagites. And again, you're reading this and you're like, this is not good, that an Agagite gets promoted over the Jew who was faithful. And so let's continue the story. Verse 2, here's what happens next. It says, the entire royal staff at the king's gate bowed down and paid homage to Haman, because the king had commanded this to be done for him. But Mordecai would not bow down or pay homage. The members of the royal staff at the king's gate asked Mordecai, why are you disobeying the king's command? And when they had warned him day after day, and he still would not listen to them, they told Haman in order to see if Mordecai's actions would be tolerated, since he had told them that he was a Jew. When Haman saw Mordecai was not bowing down or paying homage, he was filled with rage. Now, here's again what's difficult about Esther, is that we're never told the motivations of the characters. We don't know why they do what they do. We aren't told why Mordecai does not bow down. We don't know if is it religious reasons? Is it because this Jew who had fully assimilated into Persian culture, for some reason, finally decided that this is a step that he is not willing to take? He is not going to bow down to an Agagite who tried to destroy all of the Israelite people. And so he said, out of faithfulness to God, I'm not going to do it. Is that the reason? Is it simply because Haman got promoted and then Mordecai didn't get anything? And so maybe he's just bitter and jealous and angry. Or maybe it's not necessarily religious, but as a Jew growing up, he would have just kind of understood, been taught maybe to not like, to hate the Agagites. And so maybe it's not religious, it's just the fact that he's an Agagite, that he's not going to bow down because he doesn't like Agagites. We're not told. Now, most commentators seem to think that there probably are religious motivations for this, because we're reminded twice in these couple of verses that that Mordecai is a Jew. So it's likely that that Mordecai, maybe for the first time in life, is trying to be faithful. But again, we're not quite sure. What's also interesting is that Haman doesn't even notice. Right? Haman doesn't even notice. He has to be told that Mordecai, and also is reminded that he is a Jew before Haman actually is like, oh, I'm going to do something about it. And so here's what he decides to do. Verse 6. And when he had learned of Mordecai's ethnic identity, it seemed repugnant to Haman to do away with Mordecai alone. He planned to destroy all of Mordecai's people, the Jews, throughout Ahasuerus' kingdom. Now, finally, what we see here, the plot of Esther is revealed. The background behind what is going to take place is finally told us, that there is going to be a massive battle, or the massive struggle between the Jews and the Agagites, or the Persian Empire, yet again. And now, if you have maybe you've never read this story before, maybe you have no idea how it's going to end. Here's what's interesting: that now you start to see, okay, that there's this genocidal plot going to happen, and I'm not sure how it's going to end. But I do see that God has actually been faithful all along. That you begin to see that God is using Mordecai, maybe in spite of himself. That God is using Esther, that he's placing a Jew as queen. We're not quite sure what's going to take place, but it seems like it's a little bit providential that a Jewish queen has actually come to the throne. Now, the story of Esther really begins. And so there's a threat of death. We're not quite sure what's going to happen, but we see that God has been faithful in the past, and this is why this is important for us to remember as we read this text. That seeing God's past faithfulness helps you trust him in the future. When we remember and reflect on how God has been faithful to us, it doesn't mean we exactly know how things will go for us in the future, but it reminds us that God is good, that God cares, and that God is there even when things turn out the way that we do not like them, or they go differently than we expect. This is why, just as a side note, things like Bible reading are important. It's not just about what can I get out of reading Scripture today to help me through the day. What it does is it reminds you of God's love and God's faithfulness, so that when difficult things come, you're not scrambling to try to find out if God is there or if he cares about you, right? God's past, seeing it in the past, help you trust him in the future. It's a reminder, maybe in my story, as I was talking about, after I worked this job I didn't want to do, I eventually started raising support to do a church plant residency here in Raleigh, from which we would get some additional training to start the church planting efforts of New City Church, where all of us are today. And so to make that happen, I had to raise my own full-time salary for a year, which was pretty daunting and intimidating. But we go through it. God is faithful. The residency comes to the end, and now I have to raise support for a church, which takes a lot more money and effort than just one person's salary. And again, I was intimidated. I was scared. However, I saw that God had been faithful in the past, and so that he could be trusted for something on even a much bigger scale. It's interesting to me when we see people of maybe giants of the faith, maybe especially people that are a little bit older, that have gone through things that are difficult and hard in their life, and were moved by their faith and their trust in the Lord. Oftentimes we just assume that they woke up one day and decided to be faithful. What's actually happening is that over the long haul, they've seen God be faithful time and time again, and so it allows them to trust him even in difficult times. And so for you and for I, maybe the question is this: what small thing can you trust God with now? Maybe it's being generous for the first time and trusting God with your resources so that when things go south, you have a track record of God's faithfulness. Or maybe this 21 days of prayer and fasting is an awesome thing for you to do. For you to, and it's not mean you have to fast for 21 days, although that is a thing that people do. Maybe it's just a meal once a week. Maybe it's certain types of food that you restrict yourself from. Maybe over the next 3 weeks, you do 24 or 48 hours of fasting one time a week over the next 3 weeks. Whatever it might be, this is a time for you and I to get before the Lord to experience his closeness and his nearness as we pray for ourselves and our church and our city. It allows us to do small things to see God be faithful now so that we can trust him in the future. And so let's get back to the story, starting in verse 7 of chapter 3. Here's what happens next. In the first month, the month of Nisan, the king Ahasuerus' 12th year, the pur, that is the lot, was cast before Haman for each day in each month, and it fell on the 12th month, the month of Adar. So the 12th year of King Ahasuerus' reign is about 5 years after Esther had become queen. The pur is cast by Haman to see when he should actually make this genocide, this death and destruction come to pass. The pur was kind of a pagan astrological or a magicianal method to kind of consult the gods. So whenever you decided you want to do something, you want to make sure the gods are on your favor. Maybe a modern example could be like rolling the dice, trying to figure out whether you should do something or when you should do something. He said, I'm going to do this, so let me cast my lots, let me do the pur, let me go before the gods so that they can tell me when to actually make this come into effect, and that's what he does there. Verse 8. It says, Then Haman informed King Ahasuerus, there is one ethnic group scattered throughout the peoples in every province of your kingdom, keeping themselves separate. Their laws are different from everyone else's, and they do not obey the king's laws. It is not in the king's best interest to tolerate them. And if the king approves, let an order be drawn up authorizing their destruction. And I will pay 375 tons of silver to the officials for the deposit in the royal treasury. And so the Jews, again, they're scattered throughout the kingdom. However, Haman here is no doubt exaggerating their influence and their number. Again, he's trying to get the king to go along with his plan. And what's interesting is that although the Jews had been assimilated, as we talked about last week, 120 years at this point, many of them had still had kept up enough faithfulness, enough identity in who they are in God's people, that everyone else seemed to notice that there is something different about them. And so again, Haman is trying to use this for his favor, not only exaggerating their influence, but he's also exaggerating how much money they could take from the Jews if they killed them, because he wants the king to agree to what is going on here. And so here's how the king responds, verse 10. The king removed his signet ring from his finger and gave it to Haman, son of Hammedatha, the Agagite, the enemy of the Jewish people. Then the king told Haman, the money and the people are given to you to do with it as you see fit. And so the king gives his signet ring to Haman, meaning that he had absolute authority to act on the king's behalf to do whatever he wanted to do. Now, what's interesting here is that the king is no doubt an evil man. As we've seen in the first 2 chapters, he has done some evil